Yeah, I want to thank everybody and welcome you to today's live webinar entitled Best Practices for Automating and Standardizing Empower Use. We're going to go through a couple of items before we get into the presentation and the demonstration portion of today's session. We're going to walk through a brief agenda, describe a little bit about what we're going to hear and learn today, and then talk about a few house cleaning items before we get into the session. First and foremost, for those attending today, we thank you, and it's our goal to make the next 45 minutes to an hour very worth your while. As a follow-up item to today's session, there's going to be a couple of things that are going to come out of it. Number one, everybody who attended today is going to get a PDF copy of the webinar presentation, and you will also get a link to a video recording of today's session. And we obviously encourage everybody, if you like what you hear, if you find it useful and helpful, please share that around your organizations so other people maybe who couldn't attend today can benefit from the materials. There's going to be a number of polls launched throughout the session today. We use these polls, number one, to make sure that we're getting the right information in front of the right people. And then we'll also be sending a survey out to everybody after today's session. We like to be as interactive as we possibly can, so we encourage everybody to ask questions as we're going through. If you hear something, you have a question about it, please use the question function on the right-hand side of your screen on the GoToWebinar panel. How we're going to answer questions is when we come to the end of today's presentation, we will look at the questions we have on hand and we'll read those out loud. We will not read your name and we will not read your company. We will keep that completely confidential, so don't worry about any of that. We only read the question. Depending on the number of questions we get, if we don't get to them all, or if there's some we can't answer for whatever reason, what we'll do is we'll take those questions offline. We will answer them and create an FAQ document in a PDF format that will also go out as a follow-up item. So today's agenda, what we're going to cover, quick welcome and introductions, which we're kind of covering off on right now. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Astrix and who the company is and why we feel we have the right to talk to you today about these topics. Then we're going to move into some of the common problems that folks experience using Empower, go through some best practices, and then finally a custom field and all-in-one report demonstration. At the end, we will have that Q&A session, as I mentioned. Now, one of the things we want to do is go ahead and launch an initial poll, and what you're going to see is a poll come up on your screen, and we'd ask everybody to the best of your ability to please answer the questions. Basically, what we're looking at, go ahead and launch that. Go ahead and get that launched. To be having an issue with the poll, so bear with me 1 second here and we'll get this launched. Okay, we'll have to move on from that poll. I apologize. That poll is not coming up properly, but we'll make sure we get the next one going as we go through it. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next item. We don't want to hold folks up. We want to stay on point with the timing. First and foremost, our speaker for today. So we're certainly thrilled to have Scott Krieger with us today. Scott is with Astrix Technology Group. Scott certainly welcomes the opportunity to connect with everybody who's on the session today. That's why we posted up Scott's email address. It's Krieger@astrixinc.com. Scott's background, he's a laboratory informatics project manager and validation lead here at Astrix. And he's very much an Empower expert, whether that's through implementation, use, etc. He's got a vast array of experience in this space, and that experience includes quality audits, compliance remediation, implementation, enhancements for laboratory data systems, which obviously Empower is one of those. So we're glad to have Scott with us today. A little bit about the company. So who is Astrix, and why do we feel we have the right to be talking to you about these topics today? Well, first and foremost, Astrix is a professional services and staffing company that is dedicated to serving the life science community and scientific community. A couple of quick statistics and background information. The company itself was established in 1995. Today it is privately held. It originated as an IT division inside of APBI, which is a $300 million life science research organization. Today, Astrix operates out of 8 offices with headquarters in Red Bank, New Jersey, and we have over 500 employees. Annual revenues for the company are between 40 and 50 million, and we essentially have 2 primary divisions inside of Astrix. The first is our staffing division, widely known throughout the country, and we offer private and public staffing of both scientific as well as IT resources. And then we have the professional services division, which is focused on supporting science-based organizations in some of their technology endeavors, and that's the group that's speaking today. The type of clients we work with: life science enterprise, government, research institutions, large and fast-growing IT staffing and compliance needs at these companies. Our mission is to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. The industries we work in and technology companies that we partner with. So first and foremost, highly regulated workflows and integrations. And we find these most often at companies in sectors such as pharmaceutical and biotech, personal care, and CPGs. But we also see them in specialty chemical, petrochemical, cosmetics, and environmental, and of course food and beverage, flavors and fragrances, and medical devices. In these organizations, we're dealing with best-of-breed solutions and the best-of-breed approaches to deploying and managing these solutions. And we've partnered with the who's who of laboratory information management systems around the globe. That's going to include folks like Thermo Fisher Scientific, Waters, of course, with Empower product, Star Limbs, Dotmatics, LabWorks, Core Limbs, and LabVantage. So these are the solutions that we've built expertise in. These are solutions that folks like Scott, who I'm going to ask to come on now, has a tremendous amount of experience working with. So with that, that'll conclude our introductions. I'll turn it over to Scott, and as I mentioned, keep an eye out for the other polls that we're going to run, and we'll assure you we get those running properly. So Scott, I'd like you to come on and take over the presentation, please.
All right, thanks Kevin, and thanks for the introduction. And lastly, thanks to everyone for joining today. Hopefully we will be sharing content with you that will be beneficial to standardizing and automating your Empower implementation within your company. So as we kick off this webinar, one thing we want to discuss first and foremost is what you can expect from this webinar. And this webinar is scoped specifically to the sample set creation, process method setup, report generation, and the review within Empower. As part of that, we're going to introduce common problems. These are problems that we've seen based off of implementations or use of the systems with many different clients and also from previous experience. After we discuss some of these common problems that we see impact most industries, we are going to get into the best practices that can be implemented in order to resolve a lot of these common problems. These best practices we've actually used and implemented at many different client sites and have seen impressive return on investment for those clients, and they've been satisfied with that as well. Then we'll get into, like Kevin mentioned, a demonstration of a custom field and all-in-one report within Empower, so I'll show you that live as part of the demonstration. And then lastly, wrap up with a Q&A session. So as we move into this, not everyone on the call may or may not be aware of Empower. I'm sure you've at least heard of it, but just to give a brief overview, Waters started with Millennium back in 1992, and since then they've come out with various versions of the software all the way up to and including Empower 3. Empower 3 is the current version that is in use at most companies. Some companies still use Empower 2, and some might still be using Millennium. We've noticed that there's over 350,000 Empower users globally, and those 350,000 Empower users are operating across 4,500 plus Empower networks that exist worldwide. Of the 50 top pharmaceutical companies, all 50 have Empower currently in use at their site. And the question we might be asking is, if Empower is such a global player in the chromatography data systems, what problems exist across these multiple implementations, and how can we remediate those problems in order to make sure that our organization is a lot more efficient? So the first common problem that we've seen, and it exists across a lot of different client sites, and personally I fell victim to this when I very first became a lab analyst, and noticed that we didn't have enough Empower input fields. So Empower naturally has native fields that exist. Examples of these for people who are used to Empower would be sample weight or dilution, purity, for instance. But what happens when the user has to input more values than just those three? So what we end up discovering is that users get creative with the native Empower custom field. An example of this is if a user has 5 fields that they need to, or 5 values they need to put into 3 fields, what are they going to do? They're probably going to end up, multiplying, dividing the various values in order to ensure that they can get those values into the 3 custom fields that exist, or 3 fields that exist natively. So we've seen within user creativity. Now you take that same problem and you multiply it by the number of different users you have. So one user might find it easier to multiply 2 numbers by 1 or divide another number by the third. And then that might switch for a different user. So you have within user variability and you have across user variability. And what we've seen as the effects of this user variability and creativity due to the lack of the input fields is it usually increases the number of sample set creation time. So when a user has to start trying to figure out how to get 5 values into 3 fields, the operational efficiency and the time that the user spends in order to get these values into the fields takes a lot longer than it necessarily should. Another thing that we've seen is because users get creative, now the review cycle time due to the varied approaches is going to increase. And naturally that's going to happen because of the fact that the reviewer is going to have to go backwards and try to reverse engineer the logic that the user that inputted the values was trying to implement whenever they try to get 5 values into 3 fields. Along with this, we've also seen the increased likelihood that the analyst is going to put the wrong value into one of these 3 native custom fields, or they might completely miss putting a value in there because they're trying to get 5 into 3, and without a 1-to-1 ratio, the user might end up putting in, again, the wrong or or missing a value. By doing this, of course, if an analyst misses a value, it's going to create rework because they're going to have to go back, reprocess, and then the reviewer is going to have to go right behind them and review again the work. The other side of it is what happens if the reviewer misses a value. Now we're potentially impacting quality, and this is a huge risk for client sites that don't have enough input fields for users, and then now the users are having to get creative. And the last one we've seen is new user spin up time. So when you have a new user and they're coming on and they're understanding Empower, maybe they've experienced Empower before, but whenever there's not a 1 field for 1 value input or definition around it, naturally it's going to take the user longer to figure out how do I get 5 fields into 3 values. And 5 into 3 may not always be the case. Sometimes you might have a much more complex test method, and as part of this complex test method, it might end up being 10 into 3, which naturally introduces a whole other level of complexity. So here, let's go through the example that I've been referencing a couple of times. We're talking about 5 into 3. So let's look at an example that might be relevant to a lot of people on the call today. Percent label amount. So for percent label amount, there's these 5 fields, number of tablets, cumulative tab weights. We don't have to read them all off, but we have 5 values here, and Empower has 3 current native fields. Those 3 native fields that the values would need to be input into are purity, sample weight, and dilution. So as we were talking about earlier, the analyst is going to have to figure out some kind of creative way to make these 5 values fit into 3 fields. Now, user to user, we know that's going to be variant as to where they put the values. And then across users, we've seen that that's going to be a problem. So again, how is the user going to get the 5 values in the 3 native fields? They're going to get creative. And creativity for analysts is a problem, especially if you're in controlled circumstances and environments, because naturally, anytime a user is operating outside of creativity, or operating within creativity and outside of a controlled process, then we run into an issue. So one thing that this is going to lead us to is we have one poll question that we want to implement now, and this poll question is going to be, how are you currently performing the calculations for Empower data? And those answers as options would be everything within Empower, a mixture of Empower, maybe outside software like Excel, Empower mixed with maybe manual calculations, or all outside of Empower. And you might be operating across a couple of these different areas, but just answer to the best of your ability which one matches what your current process looks like. Just give a couple seconds for
Great, Scott.
that.
And we'll go ahead and, we will go ahead and close that poll out in about 10 seconds. So if you haven't answered yet, we'd encourage you to go ahead on and do that. And then what we'll do is we'll share the results with everybody. So it's going to close in 3, 2, 1. And we'll go ahead and share those results.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of people are using a mixture of Empower and outside calculation softwares. Naturally, the custom field and limitations on the custom fields can sometimes create the need to transcribe data, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but it's good to know where the majority of the people fall. So thank you for participation in that poll. As we move on to the next common problem that we've seen. So a lot of clients that we've worked with previously are using reports that are not locked, and part of this is because the client might want the user to have the ability to edit certain things, change precision on the column tables, etc. Or some companies and clients we've seen are actually implementing ad hoc reports. The problem that we see around both of these, with it not being locked and the implementation of an ad hoc report, is the fact that it can be edited. Now, this applies usually more to the controlled environments that this is a problem. So if you're in R&D, this might not be as applicable to you. However, even within R&D, maybe having a starting template that is locked can be beneficial to at least have a standardized output. But what we've seen that it causes is that for users who have the ability to modify column headers, whether purposely or inadvertently. So an example of this might be, a user wants to, thinks that they're doing something intentionally and adding the right column and then changing the column header to say that percent area might be equal to percent label amount. And they think that what they're doing is a valid, approachable, valid approach to making this modification to get the right output, and it's just a misunderstanding. Maybe it's inadvertent. We've also seen users that forget to report information that are required by a test method or standard operating procedure. An example of this is one time I was reviewing a report and I didn't actually see the percent label amount reported, and luckily as a reviewer I caught it, but that's not always the case that someone's going to see that or catch that one-off field that just happens to be missing, or that one-off table. Also, we've seen, like I just mentioned, sometimes the reviewers do potentially miss the modified table or the missing result. So if a reviewer's looking at that report that we had just discussed, they're going to see percent LA, and if the value looks close, they might not even open the table to ensure that it wasn't modified. And some of the effects that we've seen from this are that we've seen increased number of reviews that overlook a modified table that might yield an incorrect result and get reported. This is a very critical quality and compliance issue, and I've also experienced this one time turn into a big investigation and a recall of a product. And that's the last thing that any company wants to have to do, is recall product. Also, we've seen increased number of reviews that overlook missing required results report information, per the test method and SOP. This one's pretty straightforward. Sometimes a reviewer might be looking at a table, and the table normally has 5 columns, but this time it has 4, and they just happen to miss the one column that's not there. Again, you run into the quality and compliance issues. And then lastly, the increased review cycle time. So if you're constantly having to review across the variants or what may or may not have been reported, the reviewer is going to take significantly longer trying to understand, is all the required information here, or maybe the required information isn't there and they just happen to overlook it. But they're going to spend more time because they want to be more diligent, as most quality people are, and that time ends up coming at a cost to the company. The third common problem that we've seen, here's the example, sorry. The example of this, back to what we were talking about earlier. So let's talk through this example. The user opens a report template, and they add percent area, thinking that percent area is supposed to be percent label amount. Then they modify the column properties to change it to percent label amount. And then the reviewer looks at the report, and because percent area looks roughly like the same value that you're expecting for percent label amount, then they end up overlooking the discrepancy. Now, naturally, this isn't every reviewer, and this isn't the always case, but I've seen it happen a lot more than I would like to admit. And then lastly, the reviewer may sign the report, and now your product's released. Again, we get into the concern of, what if the product actually failed instead of passed? and what happens during an audit, like when the incorrect result is discovered as reported, because it happened to get through our process. So the best practice to resolve this problem naturally is to implement locked reports. The third problem that we've seen, and this one is actually an operational efficiency and quality impact, but is people or clients that create multiple separate reports. And an example of this would be one report for chromatography, one report for sample set information, one report for instrument method, processing method, etc. And what we've seen that it causes is it's going to cause your data to get distributed across multiple reports, and not just multiple reports meaning one or two, but usually more like 7 to 10 from what we've seen at various client sites. Additionally, the e-signature will only be present on one of those many PDFs once the document has been signed. So this means that if someone were to pull one of the specific reports and need it for something or use it for quality decisions, now you have a report that doesn't have an e-signature on it. And then lastly, the reviewers are going to have to review the multiple reports. So if you got 5 reports, that's 5 separate documents that the reviewer's going to have to go through. Additionally, if you got 7 or 10, that's 7 to 10 documents that your reviewer's going to have to go through. Every time that you add one more report, naturally it's one more document to be reviewed. So again, the effects that we've seen is that this increases the volume of reports that need to be reviewed, and naturally the review cycle time due to the multiple reports, which increases and comes with the effect of review cycle time. And naturally operational efficiency is part of that, because if your reviewer is spending more time reviewing than they should, then they could have spent that time reviewing more documents versus spending more time on one test method. So also we've seen the increased likelihood for reviewers to miss something. So that transactional or translational switching between documents has definitely had an increase on the ability for people to remove stuff or miss stuff that should have been there to begin with, but because they were originally reviewing it and the volume of documentation, they might have missed it. Also, we've seen, a limitation on the number of reports with e-signatures to just one. So you're going to have one signature on one document on the PDF versus all the other reports you'll have with no signature, which impacts quality. And what we've seen as the best practice to resolve this problem is to implement a locked all-in-one report. And the last common problem, and we save it for last because this one's probably near and dear to a lot of people's hearts and has caused a lot of pain. The transcribing and manual manipulation of data in the multiple systems, and this could be a paper-based system, this could be they're transcribing it to Excel, they could be transcribing it to a number of different softwares, or they could be transcribing it to paper like I mentioned earlier and performing manual calculations. So what we've seen is naturally it's going to cause the user to manually write or type data into one or multiple systems. With users manually or using a non-validated or validated system, they're going to be performing these calculations. And then lastly, the review of the multiple systems of data. And the last one is equally as important as the first two, because now we get into review cycle times, we get into data integrity, and these are all things that the FDA are looking at, especially with the new hot topic for them is data integrity. So the areas of concern, is naturally that the user might transcribe the incorrect result. And I'm sure we've all seen this one before. I mean, transcription of data, especially if you have to move 10, 15, sometimes 100 values between Empower and another system and then perform a calculation off of it, the likelihood is that you're going to transcribe something pretty frequently incorrectly. So naturally that impacts quality, compliance, and rework. Also, you might run into the issue of you have different results in multiple systems, and this is going to cause an investigation. Because the question is, which is the real value and which is the real system of record? And because you're going into these investigations, you're going to be spending time, quality, you run the risk of not being in compliance, and again, the data integrity problem that we talked about before. Users might perform the calculation incorrectly. Again, this comes at the rework because the user's going to have to recalculate it, the reviewer's going to have to re-review it. It's extra, and if it gets missed, it's quality and compliance risk. And then, like we had just mentioned, if the reviewer doesn't catch it, it can lead to unintentional release of product, which I don't even think we need to get into how much of a problem that could be, but naturally quality, compliance, and patient risk. And we don't want to be releasing product based off of potential error that could have been automated. And lastly, we have the review cycle time has increased due to the fact that the reviewer is having to go into multiple systems and ensure that the values are correct, number one, but that they're consistent across the different systems. So let's look at a quick example. I've been talking about the percent label amount just to kind of keep a consistent approach here. So this would be a custom field that, or an equation that would be requested by a test method. And the input fields would be dilution, sample, or composite weight, the 6 tabs weight, number of tabs, and theoretical tablet strength. So let's assume a user transcribes the composite weight as 25.6 instead of 26.5. Naturally, this is going to make the percent label amount go up. And by doing that, what happens if the product now passes instead of fails? And again, we go to what if the reviewer misses the transcription error? Now we're going to end up releasing product based on bad data. Let's say the reviewer even catches it. So that's ideal state, and the reviewer catches it, and it doesn't end up getting released. We're still going to end up coming to the problem of rework. And the goal of teaching these best practices is to get rid of rework, reduce transcription as much as possible, and make sure that quality is at an all-time high. So the best practice to resolve this problem is to implement custom fields to automate the calculation and reduce the number of human touch points on the data. So anytime that we have multiple people touching the data or one person touching the data at multiple steps, we run the risk that we're going to have many more transcription or human error-based issues. So we have an additional poll question. Which of these common Empower problems does your company currently experience? And this is amongst the 4 common problems that we've previously discussed. So we'll take 15 seconds to allow everyone to answer.
We'll close the poll down in about 10 seconds. Okay, poll is closing in 3, 2, 1, and we'll go ahead and share those results.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So as I mentioned earlier, we saved the transcribing and manipulating data in multiple systems to last, and as expected, it turned out to be the highest percentage error problem that people run into. So that being said, we'll move forward because naturally it doesn't really benefit us just to talk about the problems that we're all quite aware of. The goal of joining this webinar is to understand what best practices and how can we implement them and understand how to get beyond our current problems. So let's move into the best practices that we've seen and implemented, and we know these to be tried and true as far as helping to keep standardized a process and make sure that it's automated. So the first thing that we recommend is to standardize user input. Now, naturally, we have people that are on the phone call that are not necessarily just QA or just QC. They might be in the R&D group as well. R&D could still benefit by standardizing the user input. They just might not take as formal approach of it. But we'll still go through this, and I'll understand why in just a minute. So what the best approach recommendation is that we would standardize the sample set, the processing method, and the amount tab user input. So for the sample set method information, some of the common stuff that we're used to seeing is number of injections, sample labels, the sample weight dilution, the various native fields, and then any custom field input values that are necessary. Also, on the processing method parameters, we would use and standardize some of these values that are listed here. Of course, the processing method has a lot of tabs and a lot of information, so we didn't input all the values here. But one of the biggest ones to point out is in the event that you implement custom fields, you want to make sure that you do document that the required input fields for the user to put the values in to ensure that they're getting the right output. We also talked about standardizing the amount tab. So if you want your processing method to work, I'm sure a lot of us are used to or familiar with what happens when your component name doesn't equal and then you don't end up getting results for your sample. So this is why standardizing the component name within the processing method and the amount tab are important. Also within the amount tab, we would have value or standard weight, maybe standard concentration, depending on if you're using solutions or not. And then the purity. One important thing here for people who aren't currently using custom calculations is that you can actually make component custom calculations. And an example of this would be if you have various dilution factors for multiple components within your within one solution, or maybe you have various theoretical tablet weights for two separate components within the same solution. So I was saying, what tools can we use to standardize this? What we've seen that works really well and what we've implemented is work instructions. So this would be a standalone document that could be managed either in a non-controlled system, or you can manage it in controlled management system. Also, we've seen test method attachments. So sometimes companies like to see it as an attachment to the test method so that it's an all-in-one document when the user goes to perform a test method. They have everything they need to standardize their approach and test. And then lastly, you would want to perform training just to ensure that the user knows how to use the documents. And again, like we had mentioned earlier, standardization for the quality side is obviously extremely important, but even within R&D, we've seen return on investment by standardizing it with just like a light copy of a standard work instructions. And they may not be controlled, but at least they're standardizing what they put in so that whenever they're building test methods or creating new products, they can help the transition from R&D to the quality side is much more streamlined. And here's an example of one that we've utilized and implemented before. It has an example of the sample set information at the top, some of the different column fields and values that would be in there, and then a description below the table of what the different fields need to be and where the values would come from. In addition to that, we talked about standardizing the amounts window as well as the processing method. So here, as you see, we ensure that the component names are equal, that we tell the user to input the standard values, purity, and then any processing method information that's necessary to ensure that the processing of the data is going to output the right information for us. Second best practice, so implement locked all-in-one reports. As we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different reports that we've seen at client side. These are just a couple of examples that are usually seen as separate reports, those being chromatogram systems. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but you see them there, and you're probably quite familiar with them from your own experience. So what we recommend is that you implement a locked all-in-one report with the exception of the chromatograms. And some people might ask, well, why not the chromatograms? For those of you who are used to locked reports, you'll be familiar with the fact that the chromatogram, once locked, is not scalable. So we do recommend that you implement the chromatogram report template, and that it'll allow the user to scale the chromatograms as needed, because what we've seen is if you include it in the previous one, then you have chromatograms that are not scaled to the right size. So implement the locked all-in-one report with the exception of the chromatograms. And then the third item we have here, add that e-signature to the first one. So what you're gaining from this is you're going to have all of your numerical data on one report, and with that you're also going to have the signature associated with it. And then you're going to leave the user with a chromatogram report template, and this report template will allow them to make the scaling that they need to, but it also provides them a standardized starting point, and then the expectation would be with training that they wouldn't make too many modifications to the document. So you might be asking, why is locking the all-in-one report recommended? And again, like we mentioned earlier, we talked about the ability to modify reports. This restricts users from modifying the column headers, which can be very important if a reviewer misses it. And if the report is built for intended use, there's really no reason that the user should need to modify it to begin with. So that being said, locking the reports allows the user to not modify it, which is ideal state, as well as locking the report reduces the review cycle time. So if the reviewer's not spending a bunch of time trying to figure out what user put what information where, they can save time by having the locked report with all the data in one location. And then the last thing that we had mentioned earlier is that the e-signature will be on the report with all numerical data. So if anyone pulls this report out of Empower, you'll have the signature right there alongside of the other data that you're expecting. So here's a quick example of that. And this is, of course, using the report template versus the actual report. When we get into the demonstration, I'll actually show you an example of this. So what we've seen here is that it creates a single report for all the data. And again, it eliminates the need to review multiple reports. Okay. On to best practice number 3, implement custom fields. So I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with what custom fields are or are not. So real briefly, we'll talk about them. So custom fields are input fields or calculations that are performed in order to generate an output. So the input fields, there are different types of input fields. Those input fields are informational as well as they are potentially used in custom calculations. So examples of this would be an informational custom field would be column serial number, maybe an expiration date, those type things. And then an input custom field that's used in the calculation, an example of this would be like the number of tablets or the % label amount, those type items. And then naturally, the input custom fields that are used in calculations lead to custom calculations. So we might be asking ourselves, why do we need custom fields? And the reasons for that are the custom fields allow the users to input one value per field. So we mentioned earlier the example of 5 custom fields and needing to put those 5 custom fields into 3 different native Empower fields. So with that being said, the user is going to have to get creative to get those values from 5 to 3. And with that, it creates the variability that we're trying to reduce by implementing these custom fields. Also, what we've seen is that by implementing custom fields, we can automate the calculation process, and automation is naturally the goal because when you automate a process, you remove the transcription and reduce the review time, improving quality. And lastly, the custom field results can be reported, meaning that we don't have to have the users taking data out of the system, using that data, manipulating it elsewhere, and then trying to push the data back into the system. We can actually have the users input the input fields and let the calculation run and then report just the output. That being said, it reduces the amount of manipulation of reports and what fields need to be edited as part of the calculation process. And by removal of the report manipulation process, again, we're trying to increase compliance and quality while reducing the review cycle times. And the implementation of custom fields is really critical to streamlining your process. It's really critical to automating the process. With the implementation of the custom fields, we've seen very big returns on implementation costs because it allows the users to not do as much manipulation of data. It allows the users not to do as much transcription of data. And naturally, that would increase quality and increases review time and increases a lot of various areas. So this is a very important best practice is to implement custom fields. So we have an additional poll question here. In which of the following areas does your company currently use Empower? And there will be multiple options here. So select the ones that are most appropriate for your current area. And we'll spend about 15 seconds.
And we'll close the poll down in about 10 seconds. Okay, poll's going to go ahead and close down in 3, 2, 1, and we'll share those results.
All right, so it looks like we have a good mixture of quality testing and as well as R&D. And just to further talk about this point, you know, the implementation of custom fields isn't selective to just quality labs. the implementation of custom fields is really beneficial for R&D as well. I've seen examples of this, especially for development of test methods or items like that, where you're always using the same system suitability criteria, or you're using the same input values. Those are very common custom fields as inputs or calculations that would get created in R&D. And the same applies to quality, of course. Quality seems to usually have a lot more standardized system suitability requirements, et cetera, but R&D can definitely still benefit from the implementation of custom fields to reduce the amount of time spent performing manual calculations. So let's look at a quick example here of custom calculation. So Empower is very versatile. What you might see or what you might be creating, depending on if you're an R&D or QA or QC, is within the test method there might be the requirement for standard check assessment, which would be the injection of one area over the injection of another area. Empower is very flexible. There's two examples here. Some clients might like to have multiple injections over multiple lines, or like one-to-one, meaning one injection per line, so it would be 2 injections over 2 lines. Other clients might like multiple injections per one line, so maybe they have 2 injections on the same line. Well, if we look at the first example here, the first example gives us the flexibility to perform multiple injections over, or 1 injection per line over multiple lines. And then the second example gives us the ability to calculate multiple injections on the same line. These are just a couple examples of a cross-sample or inter-sample calculations, but in a future webinar we intend to go a lot deeper dive into the creation of custom fields. At this point I just really wanted to show you the versatility, because Empower is quite capable of very complex calculations. These of course are simple, but the nice thing about it is able to be manipulated to current client needs. So it's a really powerful, has really powerful capabilities. So that leads us to best practice number 4, validate and power custom fields. Now, naturally this might not apply as much to the R&D people, but I still want to cover it for the quality labs. So you might be asking yourself, should I validate the Empower native fields before implementing the custom fields, or do I do them concurrently and validate both of them? We've implemented custom fields at a lot of client sites. We've also validated them. From our experience, we recommend that you would validate the native fields first before implementing custom fields. And there's multiple reasons for this, but these two are the biggest 2 reasons that we've seen why. By implementing the Empower native fields and validating them first, it allows you to bring your system live and start having users use it while still implementing the custom fields. And then also, the validation of the custom fields can be streamlined because the custom fields leverage a lot of the previously validated native fields. So by implementing it first, you gain operational efficiency by being able to use the system with the native fields to begin with, and then you can bolt on the custom fields as you get them validated and more of a staged approach. Also, you might be asking the difference, so what's the difference in validating an input custom field versus a calculation custom field? So we mentioned earlier there's multiple types of input custom fields. One might be informational, one might be one used in a calculation. If you have an informational custom field, we don't recommend validating it, because all you're validating is that you can put a value in a field. You've already tested that as part of your native Empower field creation. It's just a different field name. So we don't necessarily recommend that, but it's open to your discretion. But we do recommend validating if an input field is used in a calculation. And the reason for this is that this is now an input to a value that's going to be manipulated. So it will be implicitly validated. It's not like you're going to test the custom field itself before putting it into the calculation. So that being said, to an example that we had brought up earlier, percent label amount, say you have theoretical tablet strength. We would put a value in there, and then we would run it through a calculation that would ensure that that value, as part of the big calculation, yielded the expected output. Also for the calculation custom field. So we always recommend to validate this, and again, it goes back to what I was just mentioning. You're taking input values, you're mathematically manipulating them, and on the back end, you're going to need to test that. So that being said, we always recommend that you validate calculation custom fields. You might be wondering too, what steps should you take to validate the custom fields? So if you take the approach that we recommended earlier with validating the native fields first, then you would write a procedure specific to the validation of the custom fields with templates. Those templates would include a protocol template, that standardized document that we showed you in example 1 that standardizes the sample set, processing method, and amount tab. That'd be a template for that. And then lastly, the manual calculation documentation template. So this would be just where the user would document their manual calculation to ensure that the calculation per the test method is operating correctly within Empower based on the way that the custom field is built. So what we're going to do now is talk through a quick test scenario before we jump into the demonstration. And the reason we want to talk through this real quick is so that I can briefly give you a quick demonstration of how a test method that you might be used to seeing would be broken up so that we can take those 5 custom fields that we started with very early on in the webinar and show you where those values would be inputted using the best practices that we recommended. So in this specific case, it says count 6 tablets, so we'll create a input custom field for number of tabs. Also it says weigh 6 tablets, we'll create another input field for tabs weight. As we move down to step 4, it tells you to weigh out a specific composite amount. We can actually use the native field for this sample weight, and then also the dilution volume will be a native field. As we get down to the calculations part here, we are going to create, or we have created, a custom calculation that we'll show you called %LA. There's one additional input field required, theoretical tabs. And then, so this is a sample calculation. We'll also show you a standard check, the one that we had mentioned earlier in the previous example of talking about how flexible and how capable the Empower custom fields are. So we're about to move into a demonstration, and as part of that, like I mentioned, I'll show you examples of custom fields. I'll show you locations of where the results will be at. I'll show you an all-in-one report, and then I will show you what potential impacts we have if someone makes a manipulation of that value. So we're going to go to the Empower environment here, and we'll open this project. So if you go to the custom fields tab, as we mentioned earlier, there were some input fields that we created. So number of tabs, tabs weight, and theoretical tabs. As you'll see, there's no formula on the right. They're just input fields. There's also the native fields that you're used to seeing, which would be sample weight and dilution. And then lastly, there's the sample calculation that we created called %LA. And there's also the standard calculation that we created called standard check. As I mentioned earlier, this one's based off of multiple injections, same line, but you could perform it in multiple different ways depending on how your sample set is set up. So as you see here, this one's based off of multiple injections on the same line. So when we go back to the sample set, and we open the alter sample table, you'll see multiple injections on the same line as we had talked about. And you'll notice that you have 1, 2, 3, 4 fields here, and you might be wondering where the 4th one is, or the 5th one is that we mentioned earlier. So sample weight and dilution are the 2 native fields that already existed, so we put the values there. We put in the number of tabs and the tabs weight. Anything that you have on this line item applies to one sample and applies to all of the sample. But what happens if you have a value that affects multiple components within the sample? As we mentioned earlier, a component field can be created in order to apply values to specific components within a sample. So in this case, we have a theoretical tabs, which is the tablet strength for each different component. So the first component might be 250, the second one might be 500. This allows us to apply multiple values within a sample across individual components. And you might see value add for using this for dilution factor or other various things depending on what you need. Just want to show you that. It can be applied at a component level or at a sample level. Okay. So now we're going to quickly process this and show you some of the review screen, some of the locations of where the results will be located at. All right, processing is done. So we'll go to the result set. If we go to the review screen here, we had intended that this calculation would happen for the standard. So as you see here, regardless of what value we click, the standard check calculated because it was based off of 2 fixed injection values. And this value is actually correct. I checked it before. Also, you'll see that the % label amount is showing up for the sample. the percent label amount being 98.283. When you're performing testing and validation, one thing I want to remind people of is you might not always have all of your output values being reported. So if you have an interim custom field that is just a step to get to the final reported value, as part of validation testing, you would want to take a screenshot here of the result to show that it matches to the precision that you want to test to. But just a quick note there. Okay, so since our values are calculating, everything's looking good, we'll go ahead and show this in an all-in-one report template that we created. So in this specific example, we just made a quick demonstration, but we have the sample set method, the processing method, the instrument method, and additional instrument method information. Then we have the system suitability information, and as you see here, the 1.02 that we were used to seeing on the review screen, as well as if we go down, we see that the percent label amount is 100. Now, earlier we talked about the percent label amount was not 100. So if I was a reviewer, I might look at this value and say, oh, okay, it passes at 100.00. Let's take a deeper look into the report and see why that value is not 98.23. Even though it's called percent LA, which is what we expected the value to be called. If we open this field, it's actually percent area, like we mentioned in the example earlier. So percent area is yielding 100.00, but the analyst might have modified the name to be percent LA, which would then naturally create a problem for us if we didn't catch it. We might have just released this product if the specification was 98.5. So let's do this. Let's put it as it should have been in the event that the field was locked, or the report was locked. So now if we open it, we see it's the percent LA value, our column custom field. We hit apply. And back to the original point that we had earlier of not having locked reports, this is the risk you could run and easily miss that if you weren't paying attention. Now we have the 98.283 value that we were expecting. So this would be the point at which we would lock the report as part of testing and ensure that users aren't able to make this modification, because that could be a huge quality risk, and last thing we want to do is be releasing product just due to an inadvertent error that a user might have done. So that's just real quick for a demo of the Empower and the custom field, the ability to modify reports. So we'll switch back over to the PowerPoint and webinar. And the next thing that you might be asking yourself is, why don't companies use custom fields? This is one that we ask a lot, and these are some of the answers we've gotten. And the reasons for that is usually lack of exposure, so they aren't aware of custom fields or they don't know what they can do. And that leads to the second bullet here, a misunderstanding of the capabilities. And are they flexible across multiple injections one line or multiple injections across multiple lines? We've also seen that clients undervalue the operational return only because, to another bullet we have here, they don't have a way to measure the value of the return. And they also don't necessarily understand the level of effort to implement the custom fields or to validate it. They might find it to be quite difficult. So one thing that Astrix has been doing for years as we've implemented these things, these custom fields and validated them in all-in-one reports, is we measure the return on investment value by using quality and operational metrics. And by implementing the best practices, you can expect 3 buckets, but within those, very high returns. For the quality part, the reduction of transcription errors, and as we saw earlier, transcription was the #1 top polled issue that a lot of people are dealing with today. So by implementing these, you can reduce transcription errors, and we've seen it as high as 82%. Also, you can reduce the investigations. We all know that investigations take time, they take resources. I mean, they end up taking rework usually because someone's going to have to do additional testing. And by implementation of these best practices, Astrix has seen a very significant reduction of investigations at 44%. And then lastly, we talked about earlier, data integrity is the new hot topic of the FDA, and they're really trying to understand how to control data since we are moving into a much more informatic world. And we've seen reduction of data integrity observations related to Empower as high as 77%, which is really impressive. Naturally, if we were reducing the number of transcription errors or reducing the number of investigations, and the data integrity observations, we're going to reduce the cycle times. So we've seen reduction of review cycle times by 57%. We've also seen reduction of report creation time by 92%. And the reason for this is by automating with a locked all-in-one report, the only time that the analyst is going to spend now is a quick review and maybe doing some minor scaling of the chromatography report that we mentioned earlier. And because we've standardized the inputs, it makes it a lot easier for the users to train and understand the test method. Now all they need to know is if I pull the standardized document, this is what it's going to look and feel like. So we can standardize their training process and also reduce the orientation time by 21%. Lastly, if we're reducing the amount of time spent, then we're going to increase the operational output. So we've seen the number of products tested by analysts increase by 30%, and we've also seen the number of products reviewed by a reviewer increase by 46%, which is great to hear. And like we like to see this when we leave clients to follow up saying, you know, we're much more operational now than we were when we started, and we're so glad that we implemented. So just kind of some feedback we've gotten over the years. So one thing that Astrix has done and implemented is we maintain a robust custom field database. This database has over 1,000 implemented and tested custom fields. And along with that, because we have implemented these at so many different client sites, we've really gotten down the understanding of how to implement, select settings that are required, as well as various options that need to be changed. For instance, here you see a couple of examples: result set only, result set first. What's their impact, and how does it apply to the client? And by us knowing this and having this database, this allows Astrix to reduce our implementation time. Also, we own a template for the standardized document that we were talking about earlier. You saw one of our very light examples, but we've leveraged this template at very many client sites that we've implemented around the world. And it doesn't take very much modification for us to implement it, but we've really seen and got a lot of good feedback on the template that we leverage for these different clients to standardize their process for users. Also, Astrix has implemented all-in-one reports for many clients. This is really important because each client is always unique to us. Every single one is important, but they also have various requirements. We're experienced in building these reports for the clients based on our understanding with what the client needs are, and we can create an applicable all-in-one report for them. And lastly, we have a developed validation package that we've utilized at many client implementations as well. It includes, but it's not limited to, the documents that we mentioned earlier, the procedure protocol templates, the documentation template, etc. This has been a very successful validation package so far. We haven't had to modify our approach too much. Again, we're aware that clients are unique, but Astrix has shown really great success with implementing our validation process that we've developed over multiple different client sites. So the one thing that we want everyone to take away from here, again, are the 4 common problems that we've discussed, those being limited Empower input fields, reports that are not locked or ad hoc report creation, creation of multiple separate reports, and transcribing those data into multiple systems. And the best practices, I'm not going to go through them, you can see them here, but if implementing all 4, you can really see a lot of returns. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that these problems are costing many companies large amounts of money. They're costing large amounts of time, quality, compliance, data integrity, and operational efficiency. So if you implement these best practices today, you can see a lot of return, and if there's any way that Astrix can help you, please let us know. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin for a quick Q&A. I know we're running a little bit long here, guys, so I apologize for that. But Kevin, turn it over to you.
No worries, Scott, and thank you very much for, I think, what everybody would agree is a highly informative presentation and demonstration. We very much appreciate that. So a couple of things here as we wrap this session up. We do have some questions on the floor. I want to encourage the folks that are on to, by all means, ask any questions you want in the question section. It's open. You can type them in, and again, we won't read your name and we won't read your company information. So let's go ahead and get into a couple of the questions that had come up on the floor while we were doing the presentation. The first one I wanted to tackle is, can some of the transcription error be reduced by transferring the data from Empower into a text report?
Okay, so I guess it depends on how we're defining transfer. If we're talking about exporting data with the electronic means, so transmission via an interface, electronic interface, it could reduce the amount of transcription error. We've seen that happen before. The only risk that you run is then you're still going to have to manipulate the values, either using Empower or manually. And that usually ends up leading to either needing to validate a downstream system or still the potential for calculation errors. But good question.
Appreciate that. Given the time, I think what we'll do is we'll do one more question. I got another one here I want to tackle, and then I think we'll do the rest in FAQ, Scott. So can a calculation field work in a way it addresses specific peaks within a run?
Yep, and absolutely. So we talked about the capabilities of Empower custom fields. And one of the things that we can do is, as part of the custom calculation, we can label specific values to come out of specific components. So we talked about standardizing the user inputs. If the user puts the correct component name, you can leverage the component name within a same injection for multiple peaks to give you multiple different values. Again, good question.
Great. And I think we're going to wrap that up given the time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we will get other questions out via FAQ document if need be. To get in touch with Scott or another resource internally here at Astrix, Michael Zukowski, you can send an email directly into empower at astrixinc.com. You can also reach out directly at the phone number listed, 919-223-4517, and online at astrixinc.com. Please be aware this is one of several sessions that we're going to be putting out around Empowers. We've got other ones coming up in November, December, and January. These are tentative dates right now, so look for an invitation once the dates are finalized and the registration forms are up. We'll go ahead and stop the recording.